I remember that day like it was yesterday, although years have passed since I first saw Santiago Airlines plane 513. It was a cloudy morning at the Porto Alegre airport. As usual, I was doing my morning runway inspection routine. The whistling of the wind between the planes waiting their turn to take off filled the air as I walked, but soon that sound would be eclipsed by a louder one. On the horizon, through the mist, I saw an unmistakable shadow. It was a plane, but I had not been given radio indications of any landing. The closer it got, the stranger it seemed to me. It didn't have any of the colors typical of the companies we operated. It landed, and instead of stopping at the usual areas, it stayed waiting at the end of the landing strip. That was very dangerous. If a plane arrived, there could be a collision. Then I asked my companions over the walkie what plane that was. From control, they told me that they couldn't contact the pilot, nor did they have any information. It could have been a commercial plane that had to make an emergency landing due to a problem. What was very strange was that the controllers hadn't noticed their presence in air traffic. The instructions they gave me were, first of all, to quickly approach the plane to talk to the pilot and ask him to leave the runway due to the great risk it posed. And then other people in charge would come to ask for explanations. My role was to maintain security in that area in order to prevent collisions between aircraft. As I approached, my mind continued to fill with questions. What was that plane doing there? Why hadn't it been registered? The plane had stopped its engine, but no one came out of there. So I asked for help from colleagues over the walkie to bring the moving ladder and access the interior. As I walked up the stairs, a strange feeling enveloped me. That plane was old and worn out. It was clear that it hadn't passed the latest inspections because it failed to comply with many of the current safety protocols. Between 3 men, we managed to open the door. And that's when I saw them. The passengers were corpses, motionless in their seats. Their faces were frozen in an expression of terror, as if they had witnessed a tragedy before death claimed them. I swallowed hard as I continued to advance, my mind not being able to comprehend what I saw. It was as if I had traveled back in time. The fabrics, the seats, the people's clothes, everything was from more than 30 years ago. And that smell of death, I wouldn't know how to explain it. I retched, and I noticed how the air was so contaminated that it burned my lungs, as if the oxygen itself was impregnated with the desperation of those who had died in that place. Afterwards, I headed to the cockpit. My heart was pounding in my chest as I opened the door and was met with the most terrifying scene of all. The pilot and co-pilot were sitting in their seats, as if they had been frozen in the act of piloting the plane. Their hands still gripped the controls tightly, as if they had been fighting to maintain control until the last moment. I stood there paralyzed, unable to look away from the lifeless bodies in front of me. What had happened? I didn't know the pilots, the plane, the navigation instruments. Everything was tremendously outdated. I found myself in the middle of a completely surreal situation. If it weren't for the fact that I thought it was impossible, I would believe that that plane had traveled in time. I decided to take a closer look at the passengers' belongings in search of any clues that might shed some light on what had happened. I found old newspapers, worn magazines, and briefcases full of documents dated more than 3 decades ago. As I reviewed each of these objects, a memory crossed my mind. This wasn't just some old plane that had mysteriously appeared. No, it was something theoretically impossible. That aircraft was Santiago Airlines 513. The same plane that had disappeared without a trace more than 35 years ago. I took my phone out of my pocket and searched for real images of the plane and the company. Everything was the same. I remember the stories I had heard about that fateful flight and the press publications that spoke of its disappearance. And while I was standing in the middle of the remains of that flight lost in time, how was it possible that it had reappeared out of nowhere? And what had happened to its passengers and crew? I decided that I had to immediately report this discovery to the relevant authorities. I couldn't allow that mystery to remain unsolved, not only for the sake of the families of the missing, but also for the safety of all those who were flying. I got off the plane and headed towards the airport in search of help. There were many unanswered questions. But I was determined to discover the truth behind that flight. Hours later, they closed all air traffic and evacuated the airport. All travelers who had a departure that day were transported by buses to the nearest airport, and others were given free hotel rooms. Shortly after, people from all kinds of organizations arrived. Police, firefighters, doctors, forensics. Even the president and high-ranking government officials arrived. A little later, the army arrived and they put us witnesses in a room. After waiting for several hours without being given any type of explanation, a detective told me that she wanted to talk to me alone. First, she asked me what I had seen, and I explained the entire situation to her exactly, since I had seen the plane fly over the airport. Afterwards, her expression changed and she told me that it had all been a confusion. That plane, of course, was not Santiago Airlines 513. That was impossible. You will understand that this, even if it was a misunderstanding, it isn't good for you to tell it. We ask that you don't discuss this with anyone, not even your family. You know, this could create unnecessary chaos if it reached people's ears. I was outraged. Were they seriously going to make me believe that I had hallucinated? I quickly replied, "No, look, miss. If you don't want this to come to light, because it could make the country panic since it breaks absolutely all the rules of logic in life as we understand it, look, that's fine with me. And I will collaborate with you. But please don't make me believe that I don't know what I've seen, because both I and you know that this is out there. It is something very big." The woman pursed her lips and asked if she could trust me, to which of course I said yes, so I did it. Sometime later, rumors began to emerge about what had happened on the plane. I had given my word, and at no time had I said anything about the case. And it wasn't for lack of desire. Imagine what it was like for me that day to come home and go to bed to sleep with my wife, pretending that the airport had been evacuated due to a fire. I couldn't tell her what I had seen. Well, it didn't take long for them to come to my house and take me into custody. Why? According to them, for telling lies, when I hadn't said a word. And I still have several years in prison to serve. Well, you're not going to believe it. The person who had told everything had been a security guard, who had seen it through the glass but had pretended in front of the police that he hadn't heard anything. I will never know what force brought plane 513 to our airport, or what really happened. But what I did discover is that there are secrets in this world that should never be unearthed, and horrors that should never be faced. This story is based on a legend that circulates on the internet. Some claim it was real, others that it is a hoax. We tell you the details. It is said that on October 12, 1989, the Porto Alegre airport in Brazil witnessed something that would change history forever. In the air, and detected by their radios and antennas, was an old and discontinued model of airplane. The plane continued to approach and landed on the runway without contacting the control tower. The aircraft then stopped, keeping its engines running. One of the first things that surprised the workers who were there was the plane model and the name of the airline. It was Santiago Airlines Flight 513. What was the problem? That plane had been missing for more than 3 decades. History states that this plane had left Aviation, Germany in 1954. The flight had taken off completely normally, but at one point, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, they lost connection with them and it disappeared. The authorities assumed that it had crashed in some area and that the remains submerged in the abysses of the ocean. As a result of this disappearance, Santiago Airlines closed its doors to the public in 1956, and nothing more was ever heard about that plane. When the airport workers came to check the aircraft that had entered the runway without permission, they got a terrible surprise. Sitting in their respective seats were the corpses of the 92 passengers from the original flight. And in the cabin, the skeleton of the pilot, Miguel Victor Curi, was still holding the control. The newspaper, the Weekly World News tabloid, in its edition of November 14, 1989, was the one that described the event. One without precedent, although it had not been signed by the testimonies or by the authorities. That article stated that the scientific community, including Dr. Celso Atelo, was investigating the case with great discretion. Everything seemed to indicate that Flight 513 would have crossed a line between space and time. For its part, the Brazilian government didn't comment on the matter, nor did any other official body. Urban legend or a paranormal event that they have kept secret? What do you believe? And before we leave, we take the opportunity to tell you some curiosities about airplanes that you probably didn't know. The first one. Do you know that the pilot and co-pilot, for safety reasons, are never served the same food? This isn't a hoax. We have compared this information with data from official aeronautical schools. But do you know why? In general, the crew usually eats something different from the other passengers. But the pilot and co-pilot are served different dishes between them in case the food is bad, to prevent both of them from becoming intoxicated and there being no one who can handle the plane. Second curiosity. What happens to a plane when it is struck by lightning? Well, as we have discovered on airline pages, lightning striking planes is very common, and it happens more often than we think. Current airplanes are designed in such a way that they act like a Faraday cage. So lightning doesn't affect the interior of the aircraft and doesn't pose a risk. 3. Surely at some point when you have traveled by plane at night, you have thought that they dim the lights to let you sleep. Well, it's not exactly for that reason, but for security. The most critical phases of a flight are takeoff and landing, and in the event of an emergency evacuation, passengers' vision will quickly adjust to the darkness. By dimming the lights, the eyes gradually adapt to the darkness, and in the event of an accident, it will be easier to go to the plane's emergency exits. 4. Did you know that falcons are used in most airports as a security measure? Areas where airports are located often attract various birds due to their large open areas and availability of food. But these birds can pose a great risk in the event of a collision with aircraft. For this reason, falcons, along with their trainers, have a fundamental role. Its mere presence in the area is enough to discourage other birds from approaching, thus avoiding settlements of nearby birds or that cross the path of an airplane. 5. Although we have heard the word black box 1,000 times, the device that records and stores all the pilot's data and conversations during the flight, the reality is, it isn't black, but orange. 6. Do you know how long the oxygen mask on airplanes lasts? Well, it lasts an average of between 15 and 20 minutes. It is estimated that it is the necessary time required by a pilot to land. 7. If you have seen many plane crash movies like The Society of the Snow, and you are truly terrified of suffering an accident, it is said that the safest seats on the plane are those in the back. In the event of a collision, seats in the rear behind the wings have a better chance of surviving a plane crash than those in the front. It is estimated that those located just behind the wings have a 69% chance of survival, and those located right in the wing area have a 56% chance of survival. But it is very important that you know that the plane is the safest transport. Enjoy your trips whenever you can. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, and if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode!